Welcome, everybody. Sorry we're a little bit late. We had votes in the House. I'd like to welcome General Jonathan Vance, Chief of the Defence Staff, to update this committee and Canadians on Canadian Forces' current operations. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you once again. As Chief of the Defence Staff, I'm responsible for providing military advice to the Government of Canada, but I also have the privilege to engage parliamentary committees such as yours to discuss issues of importance to the defence of Canada, and I'd like to personally thank you for all the work that you do. I take my responsibility seriously, as do you. And today I will provide you with a short update on some of our operations, following which I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Je vais commencer aujourd'hui.
I'll begin today with a brief overview of my primary responsibility, that is, the defence of Canada. Our international operations tend to draw the most public attention. But while more than 1,000 Canadian military members are deployed internationally, tens of thousands work every day here at home along all three coasts and across the breadth of our country. This assistance takes many forms. One of the most important is our involvement with the National Search and Rescue Program. We operate 3 joint rescue coordination centers in Victoria, Trenton, and Halifax, and provide military resources to more than 1,000 incidents each year.
Important on our east and west coasts, where our citizens live and work with the dangers of wind and tide. Every day, air crews at Gander, Greenwood, Trenton, Winnipeg, and Comox stand ready to assist Canadians in distress, as do our search and rescue technicians, each ready to leap into harm's way at a moment's notice, and each day honoring their motto, that others may live. We also have other standing missions inside our borders. Consider Operation Palachi as one example. Every year we deploy teams to the critical Rogers Pass in British Columbia, just 3 hours' drive from Kelowna. There, our gunners use artillery pieces to prevent snow buildup in the surrounding mountains, reducing the risk of a major avalanche that could block the pass. With more than 4,000 vehicles and 40 trains passing through Rogers Pass every day in the winter, this modest effort helps save lives and protects the vital flow of commercial goods between British Columbia and the rest of Canada. Et je suis certain que des membres.
I'm sure members of this committee will also be able to recall specific natural disasters to which the Canadian Armed Forces have been called to assist, such as floods in Manitoba, the effects of Hurricane Igor in Newfoundland and Labrador, the evacuation of northern communities, or the wildfires around Fort McMurray.
Single out for special mention our reservists, who are not only the face of the military in their communities, very often so, and ready to support in crisis, but also form an increasingly important part of operations and training in Canada. And there are many other efforts, most notably our involvement in NORAD, seeing to our air and maritime security and surveillance, and our annual northern operations, which also contribute directly to the defence of Canada. Moving to the international stage, we continue to support Iraqis as they fight to liberate their country from the scourge that is Daesh. First, our special operators continue their train, advise, and assist mission. In the early stages, this mission was principally focused on training. Now, as Peshmerga forces have closed with a dangerous and determined enemy, the advise and assist roles become more prominent and are more critical. Yes, our troops are working with the Peshmerga as they move forward. They must in order to do their job. But the Peshmerga and the other Iraqi security forces are the ones doing the fighting. We advise them on plans and tactics. We assist them if they are unable to defend themselves alone against a threat. And we provide them with the same support we provide to other coalition partners, including our enhanced intelligence capability, which continues to support the coalition. Medical personnel have also been deployed to a Role 2 medical unit in the region. And the ministerial liaison team is working within the government of Iraq with a Canadian General Officer leading, looking ahead to the future while also helping assure Mosul is liberated. Mr. Chair, I expect the coming months will be crucial. Iraqi military successes will need to be reinforced and solidified with political, economic, and diplomatic ones. Finally, Mr. Chair, I will address the issue of peace support operations. While I cannot discuss the specifics at this time, I will provide an outline of the principles I consider as I approach this question. The first is how these operations fit into our overall framework in terms of conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict termination, and harm reduction. Can peace support operations produce desirable outcomes in this framework? Well, if they are well managed, well planned, and supported, then yes, they can. They can help prevent conflicts from breaking out or from worsening. They can help reduce harm to civilian populations. Ensuite, est-ce qu'on peut...
Second, can we help achieve these outcomes? Yes, we can. As a top-tier military, we can help improve the skills of both UN and local forces. We can help them to be more effective and professional. This capacity building will help these countries achieve lasting stability. We must help them achieve their own security. And finally, can we mitigate risks to our people and to civilians? Yes, we can. We have learned lessons over several decades of EU missions. Beyond simply placing forces into a particular mission, we must retain some control over them. We must ensure that they are able to act and to protect themselves. And we must consider all aspects of a mission, including the different threats faced by subsections of the population, women or children, or fighting-age males, and plan how to address those. These are broad principles I must consider as Chief of Defense Staff, and I will be happy to expand upon these principles with you today.
Members, I have not yet mentioned Operation Unifier or reassurance efforts with NATO. I believe I could probably fill all of your time today with details on our current operations. But I would like to leave you with one last point, and in many ways it's my most important one. We will only succeed on operations if we succeed in looking after our people. If we build a culture where each and every member of the Canadian Armed Forces is treated with respect and dignity as they train to that high skill level that we expect of them, one that allows them to serve their country to the full measure of their ability. So whether it's eliminating harmful sexual behavior through Operation Honor or making sure that military families are looked after while their loved ones are away, there is both a moral and operational imperative driving these activities, which is why looking after the people I have the privilege to command is and always will be my top priority. Mr. Chair, I am grateful for the opportunity to testify before you and the committee today. Thank you, merci, and I'll be very happy to take your questions, sir.
Thank you, General. Just in order, we all know we lost some time here, so I'll be a little less flexible with running over. And having said that, Mr. Garrettson, you have the floor for 7 minutes. Or sorry, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General, for being here today. Welcome, and thank you for all you do in your service to our country. I wanted to ask you and chat a little bit about mefloquine, the anti-malaria drug, with the possibility of sending troops to some countries where malaria is a current problem and a current issue, and knowing that the U.S. and the United Kingdom have now banned mefloquine. I believe the U.S. is maybe even 6, 7, 8 years ago. Australia and New Zealand are considering it or discussing it, and I'm not sure about other countries. This is a big issue in my constituency, my riding of Dartmouth, Cole Harbour. I've met with veterans that take this very seriously and are very concerned about mefloquine. Now, I understand it was taken voluntarily by our military members, but with new issues possibly popping up and side effects that perhaps weren't known back in the 90s when we were administering mefloquine, at least in a larger capacity. Do we have a plan? Is there a plan for our country to discontinue the use of mefloquine or to ban it? And if so, is there an alternative for when we send troops into countries where malaria is a major issue? You know, I wonder if you could maybe chat a little bit about what we are looking at or considering doing going forward.
Thank you for the question. This is before the Surgeon General right now. If it's an issue that concerns our reservists, our veterans, an issue that is on people's minds, it's certainly on mine. And so it is before the Surgeon General. We will use the scientific approach in this regard. There are alternatives to mefloquine that have been used on other missions. And I think it would be premature right now to foreshadow the advice that the Surgeon General will give to me before he does so. But I appreciate the question, and it is being looked at as we speak.
Okay, are we currently using just mefloquine, or are we using different alternatives now while this is before the Surgeon General, or is this something, are you able to elaborate a little bit on exactly what the use is right now of mefloquine?
I don't have the exact details of what we're doing today on various operations. I do know that the use of mefloquine has, is less prevalent as it was in the past.
And my understanding was that mefloquine was the drug of choice because you took it once a week, where there was an alternative that you took every day. Do you know what the name of that alternative is? That slips my mind right now.
Mine too.
Oh, okay.
Maybe that's
Okay.
because I took it. I don't know.
Did you take it?
No.
Okay.
But if I could, Mr. Chair, maybe I take this question on notice to give you a more fulsome explanation of where we are at exactly right now. I know, having done operations where I've taken anti-malarials, which was not mefloquine at the time, each operation is different. The threat vectors through the mosquito population are different. We take a prophylactic approach to protect our forces no matter where they are. And each approach is different. So I think it's probably best that I offer you on notice a more fulsome explanation of exactly where we are at from a medical perspective, how that prophylaxis works, and when the Surgeon General finishes his work on this and reports to me, we will certainly share that with the Canadian public.
Do you know when that might be, when the Surgeon General might report back?
I don't have a date right now.
Is it imminent, or is it years away?
It is absolutely not years away.
Okay.
It is, I would say it's imminent.
Somewhere between imminent and years away.
The Surgeon General has an opinion right now on the validity and the use of anti-malarials. And I think it's probably worthwhile that we put that in the take on notice response.
Okay, thank you very much, General. If there are a couple minutes left, another member of this
3 minutes left.
So I'm happy to share that if someone's got some wishes to take that extra time.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, General.
Thank you, General. And I have one question that I think will take up this time, and then my other line of questioning afterwards will be different. Can you tell us, and because we've heard two terms, train, assist, and advise, and train, assist, train, advise, assist, and accompany. What's the difference between those two terms?
Between train, advise, and assist, and train, advise, and assist, and accompany?
Yes.
Well, the difference is the first mission, train, advise, and assist, is the mission that we are on. It's the scope of the mission that we've undertaken. The use of the term accompany is used by some nations, including Canada, to describe the difference between providing assistance, providing support in planning, providing support in such things as medical evacuation, provision of intelligence, provision of expertise in planning and control of forces. And the accompany function is where you're actually fighting with them. Accompany is used to describe that you are actually with them in the fight, on the front line, in combat. So by illustration, when we were in Afghanistan and we were doing the operational mentoring and liaison teams, that was very clearly an accompany mission. When the Afghan security forces were involved in combat, not only did we mentor them in combat, we were fighting with them, shoulder to shoulder, at the most pointy end of what they did. In our mission, we are not doing that. in our mission, we restrict ourselves to the training, which I said has a predominance in the beginning, advising and assisting commanders, principally at the battalion level, on what to think about, how to contemplate the operations they're doing, and while they're fighting, to help them maintain situational awareness of where they are in relation to flanking forces, we've supported them in terms of how they can call for fire, how they manage themselves better in conflict. We are not accompanying them by virtue of that definition. Where the assist function comes in a number of, there's a number of different ways that we assist. One is through supporting them in their medical evacuation. Another is to help a commander maintain control of his forces, to help them keep an eye on things. They're forces that aren't as well trained as we are. No matter how much training we do, there's still an element of assist that we can provide them in operations. Another element of assist that I think is germane and what's certainly caught people's attention is, when is it, under what conditions would we shoot? Would we fire? It is for defensive purposes. Whether they are static and in a defensive posture, or whether they are moving into an assault or an offensive operation, we have a mandate to not only protect ourselves, the right of self-defense is inherent with every soldier, but we also have the rules of engagement that allow us, in the event that there is an attack or something is approaching those forces that would overwhelm them, and therefore they are defenseless or approaching a point of defenseless, we can engage.
And that's in assist, correct?
That would be one of the ways that you could describe how the assist function is defined. And so you've seen it reported on, I've spoken of it. It is absolutely a part of the fact that we are there with them, have the responsibility to protect ourselves, and as we have explained repeatedly, the responsibility to, in the defense of others, if they are to be overwhelmed. And a great example is we have weaponry that allows us to not be on the front line, to be well back from the front line, well back. And if a heavily armored suicide vehicle laden with explosives is approaching the line or exposed Peshmerga forces, and its detonation would result in the death of tens or dozens of them, or civilians, then we have the ability, with the weapons that we have, to eliminate that threat before it materializes.
I think that's probably it. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And through you, welcome, General Vance. How long has the Canadian Role 2 hospital been in place in Iraq?
I think it's just declared full operational capability in the last week.
How long does it take to get a casualty from the battlefront to our field hospital?
It can take, depending on where it happens, it can take minutes. We usually try to do that within what's called the golden hour, if it's serious enough.
So they can go by air as opposed to... They can go by
helicopter, or they can go by, which is the preferred method, faster the better, or they can go by ground. They are triaged, and one of the things that we do to help them at casualty collection points, given our expertise, is to help determine through a process of triage who needs to travel on what conveyance to receive the medical support they need.
What is the ratio of doctors to Canadian soldiers in Iraq? Canadian doctors to Canadian soldiers in Iraq?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what the ratio is of Canadian doctors to Canadian soldiers, but there is a ratio that we could find out for you of doctors to soldiers. Because we're working in a coalition environment, we access all manner of medical.
Okay, what number of Canadian doctors are in theater in Iraq?
I think we've got 3 doctors there right now, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, is the Role 2 hospital in conjunction with other hospitals at the same location?
There's a U.S. hospital, a Role 2 hospital, that is going to be departing that location. I don't know what the status of their movement is right now.
What type of doctors do we have? Do we have surgeons?
They would probably be general surgeons, right?
Okay. In terms of equipment, do they have CT scan access on site?
Again, I'm not 100% certain what they've got in terms of equipment.
Okay, so does this hospital, the Canadian Role 2, does it treat Allied soldiers?
A Role 2 hospital, a coalition Role 2 hospital, would treat any person that was brought to that hospital.
Okay, so does it treat civilian casualties?
It could.
Does it treat Daesh casualties, or would it? Could it?
Yes, absolutely.
How long does
So
it...
just to define that point, we would never deny medical support to any casualty on a battle space.
Okay. How long does it take to transport a casualty to a hospital that can provide more intensive care if a patient were to need more than what the Role 2 could provide?
Well, it depends on the nature of the casualty, how much stabilization they would require at the Role 2 facility. We have access to more medical capacity in Iraq proper. And then, of course, we can use the evacuation route to Lanchtoul Hospital like we did in Afghanistan.
Okay. Why are Canadian soldiers deployed in Afghanistan?
I beg your pardon?
Why are Canadian soldiers deployed in Afghanistan? We know we have troops there. What are they doing?
We have a small team there that's doing close protection for the head of mission at our embassy.
Really? So the mechanics who are soldiers would also be there to support the close protection?
I don't know of any mechanic that's deployed to Afghanistan.
Okay. What is the role of the Royal Canadian Navy in the NATO maritime collaborative effort to stem the flow of migrants into Europe? What's our ship in the Mediterranean actually doing?
Well, right now our ship is on Opry Assurance, which is a standing naval task force that is supporting NATO operations in NATO waters.
Well, we know that.
So they're not actively on an anti-migration effort right now.
So they're patrolling?
Mm-hmm.
Just patrolling.
Right. And responding to NATO direction.
All right. And now let's talk about other commitments that the government has made. Is the troop level in the support unit or service battalion for the NATO commitment to Latvia included in the overall number of, I believe, 450 soldiers that has been announced?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And would that, what would be the number of the service battalion troops were there to be the mission in Ukraine to continue?
Sorry, just...
So if the mission in Ukraine were to continue, what number of troops would be present there in the form of a service battalion to support them?
The service support element in Ukraine is a subset of the overall number that we've capped at 200 or 205.
Okay, so the service battalion is included in the 200.
Yeah, the service support element. There's not a battalion, there's not a service battalion deployed in Ukraine. There is a task force that's built principally on a unit and a rifle company for the combat training. And then there's a number of other people that are doing specialist training, medical and otherwise. And they are supported from a theater perspective by a service support element that's not a service battalion. It's a small cell that provides all of the service support that they need in Ukraine.
Okay, so another type of deployment has been talked about and will be eventually announced in terms of service battalion, making sure that the soldiers in place, soldiers, airmen, will there be enough support service to continue all the missions that we have in place right now, including the future ones?
Yes.
Okay.
We would not undertake a mission that we couldn't support.
All right. What is the Canadian Armed Forces doing to strengthen capacity in the cyber domain as agreed to at the NATO summit in Warsaw?
Well, we're involved in a wide number of initiatives. So principally, we work here in Canada with CSE and have our own organizations and agencies that look after the defense of our networks, the details of which I'm not prepared to discuss here given the classification. We are on a 24/7, 365-day basis, monitoring and protecting our networks, and continuing to increase our capability through technical means of being able to identify potential intrusions and responses. This is an ongoing effort that we do in partnership with CSE.
Are serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces being trained in cyber warfare presently?
They are. In fact, we have, when you say cyber warfare, that's a term that perhaps covers a pretty wide range. We are, right now, focused principally on cyber defense of our networks. We are undertaking an effort to be able to do offensive cyber operations, should we need to, but we're not there yet. I'm examining it. I'm putting in place the command and control. We've got to this still has some ways to go before we are either authorized to do so or have the ability to execute an offensive cyber operation. That said, we do have people that are experts in cyber operations. So instead of saying cyber warfare, I would call it cyber operations, which is broken down into a defensive and an offensive component. Right now, we are principally focused, and I have a Director General of Cyber Operations. We have a command and control methodology that allows us to develop and perfect our defensive cyber operations. And we are looking very closely with an intent to be able, at some point, to have the option of having an offensive capability.
Okay.
And that's your time. Ms. Gallant. Mr. Garrison, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General Vance, for being with us today. I do want to ask a question about the involvement of our troops in Iraq, but I want to ask it from the point of view of the person in the field and their families. Whether or not we call this a combat mission or whether it's train, assist, advise, or train, assist, advise in a company, are the people there now receiving the same benefits and supports as if they were in a full combat mission? In other words, is the hazardous nature of this duty being acknowledged in the benefits and supports that go to those members?
Yes.
That's very reassuring, because I think sometimes it's an important question of what kind of mission it is, but I just want to make sure that people are actually getting those supports.
Well, if I may expand briefly, when we deploy soldiers into an area, it's called a special duty operations area. It's prescribed by me with approval from the minister as to what exactly are the boundaries. And there is no question whatsoever, when you're in there, you're on military operations, you're on military duty at the time, and the work that you are doing is recognized as it would be for any mission. The only thing that changes are hazard and risk, and the benefit that you receive under hazard and risk. If you are in a joint operations area but not subject to the hazards and risks that someone else may be, then the exact compensation changes for that. But nonetheless, everybody's treated the same in terms of if you become a casualty, if you're hurt, if you need any support, and certainly the families are supported the same.
And so there are some serving right now who would be at that maximum risk compensation?
I suspect so.
Thank you. Right now, the Canadian Forces are operating at a rather brisk operational tempo, and now have to take on additional NATO responsibilities, which we support, and also peacekeeping responsibilities, which I also would say that we support. My question is actually about your budget and the discussion that the forces may be asked to take a 5% budget cut. How will you maintain this operational tempo and take on these new responsibilities if you get less funding than you've got this year?
Well, I think it's a hypothetical question. Before me right now is not the prospect of a 5% budget cut. In fact, we are in a process right now to approach government on a defense policy review. So anything to do with budgeting and what we might do about any budgeting, I think is premature.
Okay, thank you. I have got with me today over 140 letters from DND employees in my riding, and I know other members have received them, and I'm going to deliver these to the minister. But they express a concern about the contracting out of operations in DND and the Canadian Forces, especially around maintenance, where we're bringing in outside contractors onto bases to do maintenance work that's traditionally been done by either DND or regular serving members. And I guess the concern is very clear. Bringing a lot of non-DND personnel onto bases raises security concerns. And the second concern they raise is that these contracts may in fact go to foreign companies, even though they might be allies. And this raises some questions I know that Britain got themselves into with some of their contractors not agreeing with from countries that didn't agree with their military objectives. So my question is, have you conducted a study about the possible impacts on combat readiness and security for the Canadian Forces to do with this contracting out of maintenance work? And if so, would you table that study with us?
I think that this is a question that's probably best asked to our Assistant Deputy Minister of Materiel, Mr. Finn, who has a global view on how we contract and conduct maintenance activities.
But I'm asking about combat readiness and security of the forces.
From a combat readiness perspective, we maintain the forces necessary on our bases and wings to be able to project force and support those forces wherever they are in the world. Whether it's maintenance, whether it's the service battalion activities, other than maintenance, we maintain the ability to do so. We do not deploy forces anywhere in the world that have a maintenance requirement and not maintain them. But even on operations, such as we were in Afghanistan, where we can, Canada and other allies will contract out third line or depot type maintenance while we're on operations. But we maintain the ability to deploy and be self-sufficient for all of our operations in our maintenance capacity. So anything that's contracted in is contracted as a result of either a special initiative, a refit, and if it's ongoing maintenance, I think that's, again, this is something that you may want to talk about with ADM Materiel. As far as the contracting goes, the contracting follows the government contracting regulations. And again, I think Mr. Finn would probably be best suited to describe the details of that.
But so there's no specific study that's looked at how this might affect security or combat readiness?
There's no specific study that I know of, but I do know that as we design our force and maintain our force, we ensure that we have the correct number of people that support to those that would be conducting the operations.
Great, thanks. I was pleased to see you mention Operation Honor and Military Families Resource Centers, even if obliquely here in your presentation. And we had a very good report from General Whitecross and Admiral Bennett on the excellent work they're doing. There's some, I guess, overlap into the Military Family Resource Centers when sexual misconduct affects family members, spouses, or children. And right now, D&D, I guess, has ordered a review of the Military Family Resource Center's governance. And the 2013 report of the Ombudsman already did that review and suggested it should continue as it is. So I guess my concern, again, that I'm hearing from families is that there's some attempt to reduce the input or control of families over what happens at the Military Family Resource Centers and bring it more under line of command. Would you have any comments on whether that's what's really underway here?
Yeah, that is, I do. And in fact, thank you for the question, because I always look for opportunities to talk about support to families. There are some, and I have spoken with lots of people about this. There are some that think a review automatically means that there's going to be some sort of alteration that would maybe privilege the chain of command over the family management. I'm actually in the complete opposite space. I think what we need to do is continue to put MFRCs correctly resourced, correctly supported, firmly in the hands of families. Firmly in the hands of those who are either through volunteers or they are paid employees in such a way as to be responsive to family demands, which are asymmetric across the country. Mm-hmm. Each MFRC has a great deal of independence in terms of how they deal with their community. And they have, at the same time, a close and important relationship with the base that they support. So I think well, I know the review was launched because I wanted it launched to make certain that we're doing right by the MFRCs in every respect. It's certainly not to remove power from families. At the same time, the chain of command has to be appropriately engaged to make certain that they are adequately resourced, that they don't become a residual to other things. As we contemplate the future of MFRCs and how they might support the broader military community, including veterans, we have to make certain that they are equipped, prepared for them as well. There's another thing that the chain of command, you asked about Operation Honor. To be able to interject additional programming, or where we ask that MFRCs have mandatory programming available, there has to be some sort of connectivity and some sort of responsiveness by those MFRCs to be able to do so. To do that, they have to be funded, trained, and equipped accordingly. They also have to be in appropriate accommodations. And so there is a close connection with the chain of command to make certain that we understand where it is that any MFRC would want to go. They are not independent. They are part of our family. And so we're going to take care of them. And that's why the review is occurring.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mr. Garrison, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. General, thank you for coming today, and I have some questions about our current level of defense spending, and I'll preface it by saying that I'm not interested in asking you to get involved in the politics of it. I realize where that lays and then who's responsible for making those decisions, but my questions are more of capacity and commitments that we've made. And I apologize in advance if I do cut you off. I'm limited in the amount of time and I have a number of questions. So my first question would be with respect to the amount of spending that we are currently engaged upon, and whether or not that is enough to meet the commitments that we have with NATO. From a practical implementation perspective, can we meet those commitments with what we're currently spending?
Yes.
Okay. The next question I have, as we know, NATO has asked, is recommending that all partnering countries be spending 2% of their GDP on defense. We are spending about 1% in Canada. Obviously, increasing the spending, if we were to go down that road, would be something that's done over time. Can you see how that would be implemented? Can you get an understanding of how we could spend more over a period of time, or would that money just be going to waste?
It's a bit of an odd question, sir. I think if I could answer it this way, you're talking about an undefined time horizon and an undefined amount of money with an undefined question of whether or not it's
okay.
good
Let
or
me put it differently then. NATO is suggesting that we should be spending 2%. You're saying that the current level of spending, which is roughly 1%, is enough to meet our commitments. Are you saying that NATO should not be recommending that we spend 2%?
You asked me if we can meet our commitments now. We can meet our commitments now.
Okay.
And I think that faced with details of any spending, up or down, and a time horizon, short or long, we would come up with an implementation plan on how we would deal with it.
So, do you think that we'll still be meeting our spending? Do you think that we'll still be meeting our commitments in 10 years from now?
I believe we will. I believe that Canada is a member of the NATO alliance.
Sorry. At the current level of spending.
Are you asking me if we're going to stay spending at 1% 10 years from now?
No. What I'm asking you is that if we continued the same level of spending that is indexed annually, will we still be able to meet the commitments that are expected of us 10 years from now?
Well, again, sir, that's a hypothetical question. I don't know what the commitments are going to be 10 years from now. I'm not trying to evade the question, Mr. Chair. I just think
if the commitments are the same.
If the commitments remain the same now,
yes.
Over 10 years, I think I'd have to look at that in detail. We deal with defense inflation. We deal with when materiel is brought into service and at what spending rate. So that what that costs. So it is, Mr. Chair, it's so hypothetical that
I'm just trying to, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact that we are meeting our commitments, but we're only spending half of what's recommended.
Yeah, I think I could put it to you this way, because I know you've got other questions. It has never been my experience and is highly unlikely, in fact, I would say impossible, that the Canadian government would commit its military forces beyond their capacity. And so if we were to project ourselves forward 10 years with an undefined budget line, 10 years from now, I would imagine the government would respect its own decisions about defense budgeting and commitments to make certain that the military was able to do what it was asked to do.
Okay. I'm going to completely change gears now, and I want to talk about the changes in attitude or the changes in capacity of Russia in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Can you give us a sense as to what they might be doing now in terms of parts of the Arctic that they might be engaging in, activities they might be doing in the air that are different now than they may have been 5 years ago?
Yes, sir. In the Arctic in particular, they are developing basing in their part of the Arctic in northern Russia. They have developed basing. They are, as many are taking advantage of the ice-free time in the Russian Arctic. And that has increased. That activity has increased in the last 5 to 10 years.
Submarine activity?
I am not prepared to talk about submarine activity here due to its classification. I can tell you that long-range aviation as well, Russia has accelerated its long-range aviation activities. I won't be able to define it for you exactly here, again, because of its classification, but Russia has spent more time in the last 5 years in airspace around North America and Europe.
And a practical question, the increase in activity, does that concern you?
It does.
Given our current level of defense spending, do you think that we are currently spending enough to be able to properly alleviate your concerns?
Well, at this juncture, I can only say yes, because I deal with the force that I have, with the threats that we have, and we're able to adequately deal with them right now. I would just remind you that we are on the cusp of a defense policy review that will look at all things in a horizon beyond the operational horizon that I deal with. And that inside that defense policy review will certainly be an acceptance or an acknowledgement of the strategic situation that we find ourselves in today and projected into the future. And we'll address it thoroughly in terms of what it is that we would do about that.
Thank you, General.
Mr. Spigman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Vance, thank you very much for being with us again. Thank you for your service. I'd like to take you back to Iraq and take you up on your offer and your written submissions to expand a bit about peace support missions. Iraq is a country of great interest to me. I had the privilege of serving under the UN for almost 7 years in Baghdad. I understand the complexity of the country. What wasn't a factor at the time that I served was ISIS, and we're now moving into an environment where we're considering steps beyond ISIS being a predominant force in the theater. What I wanted to put to you is the tension that we're facing between wanting to take action and systematically take action against threats to international peace and security on the one hand. That includes the fight against international terrorism. And secondly, and I don't want to present this as a Canadian doctrine nor attribute it to U.S. Officials who may have used it, but it's the sense that we don't nation build. We intervene against terrorism, but we don't necessarily stay for the long haul and reconstruct the country. And in some cases, we get resistance from that country to become too heavily involved in the governance and reconstruction issues that would actually pull a country like Iraq out of the morass and move it into the paradigm of resurrected nations, if that's the right term. Could you talk a bit more about where you see the role of the Canadian forces between those two policy constraints, if you will? Intervening on the one hand when we have a clear threat against international threat, but also seeing the effort through to the point where a country is back on its own 2 feet. Well,
I think the way I would describe this to you is it's not just a Canadian forces effort. This is a Canadian effort. Any time in the recent past, and I think it's become more germane and acknowledged that a comprehensive approach, as you described, is required if there is to be a resurrection or a more thorough, enduring stabilization arise as a result of military activity. So I believe, and I have said this many times, that the military can play a part, a good part, a useful part in helping set conditions for the reestablishment of norms in a country that has failed or is failing. It can help set sufficient stability conditions for government to consider governing, for the access of government to get to its people, to provide sufficient stability for infrastructure to be addressed, or for the economy to consider going again. I think it is also true today that you would be hard-pressed to find any chief of defense staff amongst our allies who don't recognize the value and the importance of a comprehensive approach. In fact, it's NATO doctrine, it's Canadian doctrine, and I think we all recognize that it is useful to consider operations in the full spectrum of both time and energy, not just the military piece. And if there is a desire, and I'll end on this point, it has to be expressed by the government of the day with the resources that are available and the likelihood of success and the reasonableness of entering into operations where you would try to put together a comprehensive approach. Some operations are best left strictly to setting a quick military condition and leaving if it's a clear and present danger it needs to be dealt with. But if we are, again, it's a national decision, not a military decision, to go into what would be considered a stabilization phase. I would say that Canada doesn't do this alone. It's not whether Canada is in or out. There are many other international organizations, NGOs, the United Nations and others that do attempt to participate in the resurrection of failed or failing states, with or without a military intervention by the international community.
Would it be fair to say, General Vance, that the armed forces could do a great deal to keep that space open in which humanitarian relief can be offered and in which political dialogue can take place?
Absolutely.
Okay,
In
thank
fact,
you for
that's
that.
one of the, I would say, and that's one of the best uses of a military, is to set conditions for something more enduring to materialize after the strict military phase.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, time permitting, a brief second question. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Policy, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. General Vance, I'd like to return to Operation Impact. I'll give you time to put on your earpiece. Yes, you were saying? Sound test for the General? 1, 2, 3. Is the sound coming through? Can you hear the? Good morning, General. Then welcome. I'd like to come back to Operation Impact then. At the present time, there's a lot of discussion about our intervention there, and we play with the words. And a colleague at the beginning of his questions, for example, with respect to the actual work, if we look at the beginning, the initial mandate at the time for the fighter planes F-18 were bombing, and our special forces were there as counselors. There was no ambiguity about it at the time. There was a change of government at the request of the combatants were removed. We wanted to have a force on the ground, but to monitor the Peshmerga. And now we learn from the media. And before going any further, I must say that I understand the secret aspect of the special forces, and that this. I don't want to know where the location of this special force. I don't want to know where they are on the ground because of the security. But we are now at another level. The special forces normally work in difficult conditions. In an international coalition, there's an offensive on Mosul, and I think everyone is aware. The press is following what is being done. There aren't any secrets at the present time. So I'd like to confirm. You say that our forces on the ground were to advise, assist, and train, but they were not in an accompanying role. And I think that we've been playing with words here because we've heard confirmation that Canadian forces have a contact with the Islamic State, and there was a direct attack. There was not simply a matter of defending the Peshmerga, but attacking certain targets. I'd like to know whether you can confirm this is action that took place. It's not a secret. Can you confirm then that Canadian troops on the ground did engage the enemy in an offensive action and not simply in defense, security, or protection? Yes, I'll be answering your question in English.
Unequivocally, that the use of force by our soldiers on this operation, armed force, lethal force, has only been used in a defensive mode to ensure that our partners were not subject to an attack that they couldn't deal with. The only part of the assist function that I think may hold some confusion for others is as we help a battalion commander or a divisional commander marshal their forces effectively, get them into the right spot by day or by night, make certain that they are going in the right direction with the right battle plans, with the right fire support in place, to put all of that together so they are most effective. That is where we are with that commander as they are moving forward. But his forces are well ahead in doing the fight. If you are suggesting that our forces have been maneuvering so as to provide offensive fire, thereby taking the fight to the enemy, then you are wrong. We have responded only with fire only to provocation by Daesh, where either by surprise or by the intensity of the force that they would bring to bear, like a vehicle-borne IED that could not be stopped by any other means, we've dealt with it. And I need to be as unequivocal on that as possible. Yes, sir, there is all sorts of speculation about this. And there is all sorts of wordsmithing going on all over the place. The fact is we have a very, very firm mandate. That mandate is being very carefully and properly commanded by people that I trust in the field, who are responding effectively and appropriately to the orders, my orders, and the intent of this government. So I can't make it any clearer than that.
Merci, j'apprécie.
Thank you. I appreciate your clarifications because I think it's important for Canadians, for everyone to understand that the work being done by our armed forces is on the ground, the type of work being done on the ground. The fact is that there are special forces. There are forces from Valcartier, regular forces that have been sent to support. Our troops are an integral part then of the fighting, the combat, even though they may not be taking initiative of opening fire. They are certainly involved in the fighting on the ground. You confirm this?
Confirm that we are conducting operations at a Roll 2 medical facility. We are conducting flight operations out of Kuwait and with our rotary wing helicopters. We are conducting train, advise, and assist mentoring tasks with our partners, and we are conducting additional training, as we have been all along, to Iraqi security forces. I can absolutely commit to that, yes.
Okay.
And it is being done in a theater of operations where those who we are assisting are in an existential fight for their country.
Merci, Général.
I'd like to thank you for your bilingual presentation, General Vance. The Minister of Defense announced the return of university training at the Military College in Saint-Jean. We know that the training that will be offered is in human sciences. That is part of a review of the government's policy. And Mr. Dion also quite recently did highlight the lack of Francophone soldiers in Africa. We're not talking only of Canada, we're talking about Francophone countries. Only 20% of these troops are Francophone at the present time. I'd like to know whether the timetable for the return of bilingual training, more particularly Francophone training in the military college in Saint-Jean, is being respected. Thank you for your question. Yeah, the decision has been to continue with a program, university-level program. It would be 4 years, perhaps an additional year if we include a CJEP, mounting then to a total of 5 years. It will be offered in Saint-Jean, and this decision is being respected. It is absolutely necessary for us to continue with a good level of bilingualism in the Canadian Armed Forces for many reasons. The most important being in Canada, we have a bilingual country and we have bilingual soldiers. We have Francophone and Anglophone soldiers, and we have to be providing regularly prepared then to provide effective command, no matter what the language. People in the constituency of Saint-Jean, I think, will appreciate your answer. Let me come back to something that might be perhaps more sensitive, that was raised by my colleague, Mr. Garretson. Mr. Obama, President Obama, came to Ottawa, and in his speech, where he praised the actions of the government, there is an element that recurred. He called on Canada to increase its contribution to 2%, which is what is expected then of NATO member countries. If we look at Australia, for example, this level has been achieved, and next week there will be a number of members of this committee attending a meeting in Turkey. Several of them are contributing the 2% then. I'm attempting to put this question in a way in which you'll be able to answer. Can you tell us whether the United States, and we heard from Mr. Obama, and we've seen the election of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, I think, has been quite clear. He is going to call upon all the member countries to make their fair contribution. We are the main partner of the United States in NORAD and NATO. Is it not simply a question of justice and fairness then for Canada to reach this 2% level? Thank you for your question. I'll answer you in English.
Entirely the decision of the Government of Canada, taking all factors into account, to decide how much it spends on defense. I think, though, that it would be premature at this point in time to make any conclusions about where the U.S. will be in the days and months ahead. I think that there's still some ground to go. Canada has a proud history of deploying and supporting NATO at the expense level that the budget level that we're at. We are unequivocally valued as a partner, and I think we will continue to be so. I think there is sometimes an over-reliance on strictly a numeric figure. I'm not saying for a minute that I wouldn't support increasing defense funding. Every chief of defense staff would, of course. But to take a figure and somehow parlay that into the only metric that you use to determine your worth in an alliance, I think, is shallow and false. There is a great deal of difference between nations as to what they include and what they do not include in their percentage figures. There's a great deal of difference between nations as to how much they contribute when called by NATO to do something extra. There are lots of nations who are spending 2% of their GDP on defense, but are not doing the same level of effort that Canada is. There are lots of nations, I think, who are at or approaching 2% GDP who are not part of the enhanced forward presence, for example, but Canada is. In fact, we're not only doing it, we're part of, we're the leadership of one of them. So I would just caution from a military perspective that the metric is not the only metric that can be used, and if it is, then can provide a very skewed and perhaps incorrect view of the value of a country in an alliance.
Je suis sûr que votre réponse va rassurer les
Your time. Thanks. Mr. Prezant.
Mr. Chair and General Vance, it's great to see you again, and I ask that you pass on our deepest appreciation and gratitude to everyone who serves under your command. They make Canada proud, and they're doing great work.
Thank you, sir.
And I'm also appreciate your comments about putting people first in everything that you do as Commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. I know when we did our defense policy review consultations, we had over 50 roundtables. We heard loud and clear that the DPR has to be people-centric, that always our troops come first, and that we support them in recruiting, training, retention, and of course as they transition out back into civilian life when they leave the armed forces. Now, as the country song goes, I got a lot of questions, and the country song says, got a long way to go and a short time to get there, so I'm going to bounce around a bit with the different questions that I have that I want to touch on. I want to go back to what Mr. Garrison said about those that are currently deployed on Operation Impact in Iraq and Kuwait. It has been brought to my attention that there is some Canadian troops that are serving with U.S. command at Camp Afrijan that aren't getting the same pay and benefits as those that are stationed at other Q-80 bases as part of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I did send a letter into the Minister of Defence last week on this issue, so I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of it as well, to ensure that they are treated the same way as all the rest of our troops are that are involved in this great mission. We had General Hood here back in April when we were looking at air defense, and he told us in April that the current life extension program for our CF-18s means that we have a plane that will be able to serve our needs until 2025. Do you agree with that statement?
The ELE right now should fully come to pass. Should, with reasonable confidence, keep the CF-18 fleet flying as is until 2025.
So there is going to be no capability gap that we'll be able to cover everything we need to do until 2025 when we get the first planes to replace them into service?
Nope, that is a false deduction, sir.
Okay. Want to move on to Operation Unifier in Ukraine, something that, again, our troops are doing great work there in training and assisting the Ukrainian forces deal with Russian aggression. That agreement and that training program comes to an end in March 2017. What's going to happen after that? Do you expect it to be renewed, extended, or are we bringing our guys home?
What I can tell you, sir, is I will bring forward options to government to consider the way ahead after that. Right now, there are no plans. The mission comes to an end, but I will bring forward options to go ahead, and the government will decide.
Okay, I appreciate that. On NATO reassurance measures in Latvia, of course, we're going to be standing up and commanding the battalion in Latvia. What's the timeline of getting that up and running? And can you just give us a little bit of detail as to who our partners are, what they're going to be doing, and what essentially we're going to be doing in this coalition?
Right. Well, thank you for the question. We would intend to have everybody deployed June or July of 17 with the battle group, what we would consider operationally capable later in the fall, September or October.
And we'll be going over with all the military kit that we need to do the job that we're being asked of?
Yes, sir. So we are the nucleus of the command and control and the various enabling functions of the battle group. We are also providing a rifle company, a LAV-equipped rifle company in the battle group. Our partners, I think you know who our partners are. They've announced, so Poland and Italy with Slovenia providing a small part, and together the battle group rounds out. There are other nations, considering. Albania certainly is considering joining. But the battle group will round out with our 455 people, should come in just under 1,000, and it can be augmented by other NATO assets should it be required for exercises, training, and operations.
How much time have I left? Okay, so I'll be very quick. In your opening comments on the potential African missions under the UN command, you said that you're going to maintain some control. And of course, that's been a concern of the official opposition, is who is in command of our troops and how do we prevent what happened to Rwanda of repeating itself. And this is something we heard in our defense policy review consultations, as our veterans and some of your predecessors have been quite vocal about putting Canadian troops under UN command again. How are we going to mitigate the problems with the layered bureaucracy within the United Nations and keeping our troops safe, as well as allowing them to do the job that we're sending them there to do?
Great question. I've answered this to the Senate committee as well. I never relinquish national command of our troops, ever. And so in so doing, I will put in place the command and control capacity and the leadership to ensure that I can exercise that command. That command allows us to take actions, extraordinary or otherwise, to ensure to the safety and effectiveness of our troops and operations. I think perhaps in the translation, some might have come out as perhaps an inappropriate way of describing it. It is true that the forces that are there will respond to UN tasks to do things, which is perfectly legitimate. And if there is, and this is on any sort of generic operation, you allow your forces to be tasked by a chain of command. But at all times, we understand what those taskings are. We can assure ourselves that those taskings are valid, legitimate, will actually aid the mission overall. And as for our ability to protect ourselves, we've learned a lot since Rwanda. And I will make certain that the troops have the rules of engagement they need to be able to defend themselves and those who they work with. They'll have the rules of engagement they need in a Chapter 7 operation, if it was a Chapter 7 operation, to be able to effectively contribute to that mission to the extent that we decide as a country to contribute. We will take steps that have been learned more recently, in the last 15 years, about how best to manage operations, be it from a medical, service support, theater management level. This we will do on any deployed force, and we do that now.
Thank you very much for that. Ms. Romanato, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General, for being here today. It's a real pleasure to see you again. So I'd like to start my comments on something that my colleague, Mr. Garrison, started on, and he's been a huge supporter of me and my two sons who are currently serving, is the families. And as you know, my older son lost some classmates this year at RMC. And I've been in contact with some of the families affected by this. And I know that we recently announced the SSAV that's now underway at RMC. I'd like to know, I know the process is currently underway, but if you could provide us with an update on that initiative. I'm not sure if you're able to at this early stage.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for your son's service. The question of why to launch or whether to launch a staff assistance visit to RMC, a senior staff assistance visit to RMC, was one that I brought to the minister, and we discussed it, and we moved ahead on it. I ordered it because there were a sufficient number of irregularities that happened in a relatively small student population. That I, as a commander, and this is a premier institution for education and training, and it is the principal avenue by which we turn highly motivated young Canadians into great officers into the armed forces. We don't want anything to go wrong there. And so perhaps I was oversensitive to the fact that given my concern with how we treat people, with Operation Honor, with concerns about suicide, mental health, the excellence of our institution. When I saw enough irregularity, I decided that we needed to act. I brought that to the minister. He absolutely concurred, and here we are. I don't believe that at this juncture we're going to find anything really dramatic. But I need to make certain that the Royal Military College continues to be a good unit in the Canadian Armed Forces, and as it has been, that the environment is appropriate for turning out young Canadians into officers. It's an institution that does a lot of things, but it does them all together to turn out educated young men and women as officers in the Canadian Armed Forces. We can't lose sight of that. It's not just a university. It's not just a unit. It does a lot of things, and we had to make certain that it's working. So, with a recent spate of suicides that undergo their own investigations in terms of boards of inquiry, and as we find those details out, those details come to me, and I can put it all together in the mosaic of what we will discover about the Royal Military College. Like any institution in the armed forces, I want it to be superb in every respect. And this particular staff assistance visit is to help us find why there may be, if there are, and why there may be some challenges there. I don't have anything. They haven't reported back to me. I'm not seeking any interim reports, save for something that we would have to act on quickly to preserve the institution as we think it needs to be. I think this will be longer term, probably in the range of effective investment, effective selection of leadership at all levels there, a reaffirmation of its purpose to make certain that it is indeed remains an institution of excellence, both on the university scene in Canada, but also as a unit in the armed forces.
I thank you on behalf of military families for doing this. I'm going to switch gears a little bit different. We visited NORAD in the spring, and we met with Admiral Gortney, who was talking to us a little bit about a possible binational C2 command structure with multi-domain capabilities. Now, I can't know what's going to happen to our friends south of the border now that there's been a change in government, but what are your thoughts on this possible route? Well,
to tell you the truth, we already have it. We are a binational command structure. NORAD, I think, is 58 going on 59 years. It's our oldest permanent alliance. It is unique in the world. It's binational. Canada and the United States both owns it.
But General, is it true that we don't have? Okay.
Sorry about
Maybe
that.
I'll get another shot. Thank
All
you.
right. Mr. Garrison, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. General Vance, I want to return to, related to budget questions, not asking you to get into budget, but at current funding levels, what we've seen is several studies that have estimated there's a very large amount of deferred maintenance in the Canadian military, and it appears that because of budget limitations, things that we need to maintain our capacities haven't been done as regularly as they should have been done. I'm worried that's going to lead to some capability gaps. It also, we have I guess I'd call it a capital deficit, not just on new equipment, but when you look at the bases and facilities, like in my riding, where we've got some very old buildings with asbestos that need to be replaced. And so I guess my question comes back, without asking you to speculate on budget, do you see this problem of deferred maintenance and facilities as affecting our capabilities going forward?
Well, I think the short answer to your question is absolutely. I mean, we've already experienced it once with the inability to put to sea a ship that can support our Navy. So whether that is in deferred maintenance or in deferred capital, I take your point that we absolutely want to make certain that we don't defer maintenance and that we don't take risks with our operational capability into the future, particularly those things which we are fundamentally relying upon. I take your point as well about infrastructure. Infrastructure can sometimes feel the challenges of deferred investment. There are, I don't know what the number is, but there is sort of a gold standard of what you need to kind of reinvest in terms of recapitalization of your infrastructure, and I think that we have an ambition to try and achieve that. Some good things have been done about this. We have put under the stewardship of our Assistant Deputy Minister, Infrastructure and Environment, the management of our estate. And I think that that will go a long way to make it more efficient, more effective, and keep the funds flowing. And as it relates to capability by capability, platform by platform, I concur. We need to be very cautious when we defer investment in required maintenance, so as to not lose that capability. Generally speaking, we do not. Generally speaking, we, my experience has been, certainly since I've been CDS, it's on our mind, and we seek to invest appropriately to ensure that we don't lose the capabilities that we have.
Right.
For a question and an answer.
Question and answer. I guess I've expressed my concern before that the shipbuilding strategy has slipped from a ceiling to or from a floor to a ceiling, and that when it was originally put forward, it specified the minimum capabilities we needed, and now it's become to be considered as kind of maximum we can possibly get. Do you have a brief comment on what's happening with that attitude about our shipbuilding strategy?
I think the way we've approached shipbuilding has identified what is the basic requirement of the Canadian Armed Forces in the Royal Canadian Navy to achieve the tasks that are before them. And as I've said many times, depending on the spending level that is ultimately decided on how many ships will actually be produced, I am convinced that that will match not only the policy basis of what we would do with those ships and why we need them, and if we need more because the country needs us to do more, then I'm certain that we would have more. So I would say it's probably premature right now. The program is in its early phases. I know that the Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy and others have spoken on this extensively. So I think we need to see how it goes when we get into the build of the CSC.
Thank you.
That ends the formal rounds of questioning. We have about 8-9 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is give each party a 2-minute or less question and an answer, because I believe there's a motion that the Liberals want to put on the floor at some point before the time ends. So having said that, I'll give the floor to Ms. Gallant for a 2-minute question and response, please.
So the Globe and Mail has recently put forth a series called The Unremembered, and that is profiling soldiers who've died as a consequence of suicide. One of the issues that has been raised around this is the fact that there is a break in care in between the medical release, so when they're medically released, they don't have a continuity of care. The military ombudsman has recommended that the benefits and care be in place prior to release of the soldier. Do you see how important that is?
I do.
Okay, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move that the Government of Canada immediately begin to take the measures necessary for the full implementation of all the recommendations in the 2 reports of the National Defence and Canadian Forces Ombudsman tabled in 2016, that the government implement all of these recommendations as the best way forward to support the Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans, particularly those in transition, and that the Office of the Military Ombudsman provide progress reports to the committee on a monthly basis.
Similar, but not exactly the same.
It's off topic, so.
Actually, my question had just been on the issue of the care of the ill and injured, specifically the topic of continuity of care between the time that a person is injured and the time they're medically released. So it's this gap in medical care that is being cited as part of the reason why the soldiers may be resorting to this. And so with this, I would like to see that it is moved. And I believe it is in order.
Just 1 second.
That's in order.
Given the nature of the request, the expert opinion is that it doesn't fit the criteria for what we're doing today, and if you give us formal notice, the committee would probably hear from it in a future notice. One second.
Point of order.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, this motion is in order. It relates to a question that was just asked to the Chief of Defence Staff, which he answered. So it's on topic because it is relevant to the business and to the hearing that we have today. The Chief of Defence Staff just said that he agreed with the military ombudsman on how to move forward on transition of our current serving members as they move out and become veterans, especially those that are being medically released. And it is essential that we deal with this motion right now. And I'd ask that you call the question.
Mr. Garrison.
I think you're accepting feedback to it now because Mr. Bazan provided some. So I would just like to say that I think that this motion very much is worthy of our consideration. It would be very beneficial for the committee if the mover would table it as a notice of motion so that we could then deal with it in just 2 days from now. That will give it the current formal notice. That won't have to put the clerk at odds with another member and the chair. And I think that it would just better serve the committee if we could do it that way. And I mean, I think that this warrants a good discussion. The problem is that we have 4 minutes left in this meeting. And therefore, I would respectfully ask that the mover just table it and then we can deal with it on Thursday.
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I did table a motion asking that the committee recommend that the government adopt these and accept these recommendations from the military ombudsman. However, the government members subsequently watered the motion down so that it didn't mean anything. And we're talking about soldiers' lives on the line. And it is imperative that the recommendations be implemented. Each and every day, we risk losing another person who has served with distinction in our armed forces. And for that reason, I'm not willing to table it. I'd like to see you call the question.
Okay.
We've already had the similar debate.
This is what we'll do. I'll call a question to be conciliatory, and if people over on the other side want more time, there's a way they can handle it too. But to be fair,
Like that.
to be fair, I will put the question as tabled by.
Point of order, you can't call a question until we've exhausted debate.
We'll move on it then, and it's open for debate. Go ahead.
I mean, just to come back to that, I'm very much open to having a wholesome discussion on this. But you know what I'm really concerned about, Mr. Chair, with all due respect, is the fact that you've received advice from the clerk, who is the expert on this in terms of procedural matter. He's advising the chair. Another member of the committee is raising a point of order, which is essentially challenging the recommendation that you've received by the clerk, and I think that that really is not healthy for the committee, because obviously the chair is not going to not take the advice of the clerk. So, I mean, I think in the interest of being conciliatory on this and trying to work together, I give you my commitment that I will entertain personally this motion on Thursday and have a discussion about it when we can allocate more time to do that. So, you know, I'm pleading once again to the member to submit this as a notice of motion so that we can properly think about it and deliberate upon it.
Okay, so the advice to me is advice, and I get to obviously make a decision, and I've decided to be conciliatory to allow this debate to happen. Fair enough, but to be fair and open and honest here, you guys also have tools in your toolbox. If you don't want to deal with this right now, you have ways to deal with that. That's up to you, guys.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I will be unable to participate on Thursday, and it could be some time before we get to this again. So again, I ask the chair to call the question.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, I can't call the question until the debate. So we're going to debate this, and the floor is open for debate. And Mr. Garrison's, Mr. Romano.
In that case, Mr. Chair, I'd move that we adjourn debate on this motion.
There. All in favor?
Recorded vote.
All right. He's going to call it.
All in favor of adjourning debate on the motion? Mr. Fisher, yea or nay? Mr. Garretson?
Yes.
Mr. Ryu? Mr. Ryu? Ms. Ramanado? Mr. Spangaman? And Mr. Bazan? No. Ms. Gallant?
No.
Mr. Paulus? No. Mr. Garrison? No. So, yea, 5, nay, 4. So, debate is adjourned.
Debate's adjourned. And we still have a little bit of time. Is there another motion that somebody wanted to put on the table before we close for the day? Mr. Minato.
So, you can put the question. That debate be adjourned?
All in favor of debate?
Mr. Chair, I had the floor.
Okay, go ahead.
I would like to move before your point of order, sorry, Mr.
Mr.
Bazan, I
Minato, you have the floor. Go ahead.
I would like to move the motion regarding the travel that was submitted last week that this committee has, needs to consider given our timelines.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. You didn't recognize Mr. Romano when I moved motion that meeting be adjourned.
He had recognized me.
No, he didn't. He didn't call your name.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, I did.
You did? You sure?
I believe I did.
I'll check the blues.
Mr.
That's why I
Garrison's saying
spoke.
that I did.
And that's why my mic was on.
Okay, let's get on.
So I'd like to put forward that the motion regarding the relation of the study of Canada Defense of North America, the committee traveled to Washington, D.C., United States in the winter, spring of 2017, that the committee be accompanied by the necessary staff, and that the proposed budget in the amount of $65,293.13 for the committee's travel be adopted.
Debate or discussion? Okay. All in favor of adjourning debate?
Record.
All opposed?
Opposed? Okay.
Continue the debate.
Continue. Debate on this, or discussion on this travel request put forward by Mr. Minato. Mr. Bazan, or Ms. Garrison, or Ms. Seglan, sorry.
I have a question. Okay, so the level is $65,000. Is there any way that we could, without eliminating participation of any MPs, is there any way to reduce that amount?
I don't think so. The clerk could give us further details on it. We worked on this together, and I don't think that the money is always an issue, but I don't think that that's possible, no.
I have the same concern, just on cost. I want to make sure that if we do this, we do it after the new Congress is brought into place, and that we take the time to not just meet with our congressional leaders, but that we do spend quite a bit of time over in the Pentagon. I know in the past, when we have traveled as committee down there, that those have been the most valuable meetings that we've had. So I would just ask that we try to find a way to save some money. But I see here that even though we're down to 7 members on this budget, it'd be valuable if every member could be there, because when we went to NORAD in Colorado Springs, all of us were able to attend. And if we want to do our jobs effectively as committee members, we need to be in attendance. So I'm, again, just wondering if there's a way we can balance this off between, we have as many actually more staff traveling than we do members.
This has been a long-standing discussion at SPLE, and I will do what I can. I understand the importance, so I will do what I can to make sure that we all get an opportunity to go, but I can't answer that right now. Mr. Garrison and Mr. Pullis.
No, I was just going to agree with Mr. Bazan that I think that it's important, the timing that we go. We have to wait until, things are in place and we can properly establish those relationships. So I didn't know if he was going to put forward an amendment to the motion to that effect. I was willing to support that if that was the case, but I didn't hear that comment.
Okay,
I agree with him on that.
Let's not overcomplicate it. I think we agree the timing's important and the full membership, but there's enough room to maneuver in that thing that we can handle that after. And given the time that's available left, we can all discuss the finite details. I got to get this approved through SPLE very soon, Mr. Pullis.
Actuellement, j'ai un petit malaise.
I am ill at ease as to the fact that we only have 7 members of parliament and 7 analysts and interpreters. So there are people members who will not be able to attend. If I'm not available as a French speaker, so we don't need the interpreters. So I find myself, if I say I don't need the interpreters, well then my English colleagues will not understand if I speak French. So I would like not to be able to be in a situation where we say we don't need Pierre Police to attend because that way we don't have any interpreters. With interpretation I can manage up to a point, but except I don't speak English as well. I don't know how you're looking at this, but I don't want to miss an opportunity to
Committee is important, and I have an undertaking to make sure that we do the best we can to get all of us down there. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try and do it. And there's no scenario where there's no. There will be a level of translation for French speakers on this trip. It's the rules, and it will happen regardless.
It's not for French speakers. It's for all members of the committee.
For those people who wishing to use the second official language.
No, it's not. That's not what. Sorry, with respect, Michelle, that's not what it is. Its translation and interpretation services are available to all members of the committee, and people can present to us in French if they like, and then we can make use of the services. So I really do resent what's happening in this committee in terms of our bilingualism culture. This is not about extra service for francophones. It's about the bilingual nature of the country and the ability of people to participate in the language of their choice, whether as members or as witnesses.
Okay, fair enough. Let me.
Can you release the witness?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
If you would,
I don't know. Maybe he's enjoying it though.
Well, I wanted to say thank you. Yeah. General Vance, thank you very much for coming. You did have one undertaking for us just before I let you go for the mefloquine. If you could please report back to the committee with regard to mefloquine, we would very much appreciate it. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Caskets as well. I think we wanted to get the ratio as well of doctors to
Yes, and the ratio of, was it Canadian, specifically Canadian doctors to Canadian troops in theater at this point would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All right, let's finish this discussion or debate up. Let me rephrase what I said. There will be, and there is, going to be a level of French language translation so we can do our business in French if we want to.
I think what, if I may, Mr.
It's not even. Yeah, just real quick. It's not even a choice. It's tasked by level of department. It's not a choice.
Absolutely. I think we can vote on it.
Just for clarification, when I made my comment, it wasn't about if we're going to send down 7 staff members for 7 MPs. I would rather see us send the whole complement of members of parliament along with the 7 staff.
Yeah, I'm going to let the clerk wait in here because he sits through these meetings.
There's, in terms of the participants, SBLE, the subcommittee on budget, adopted a motion earlier during the session stating that they won't accept budget proposal with more than 7 members. So that's why there's 7 members on the list. And in terms of 7 staff, that's basically the maximum that we could bring for that specific travel. It's just to have the. That doesn't mean that we'll send 7 members. A decision will be made based on the program, the needs required for the travel. It's just that if we include 7 staff in the budget, if the need is to send 7 members of the staff, we'll have the money without having to use the cushion and so on. So that's why 7 staff are members. And again, I will say that if 7 staff are needed, 7 will be sent regardless of the amount of members traveling. Could be 7 for 4 members, 7 for 20 members. It's just in terms of having the money if the needs are there.
Any more discussion on this? All right, all in favor of the motion as put forward by Ms. Ruminato? Opposed? No. Carried. Can I get a motion to adjourn?